finishing off, how does it feel to get through like the whole book?
Like good.
Weird.
Also, do I know all of this?
Yeah. You're gonna have to read through it at least 2 more times before your registry. But either next week or the following week when we do your end of semester evaluations, I'm gonna walk you guys through how to sign up for your ARDMS account. Actually, maybe even at the end of this, if you guys, because this is kind of a quick lecture, if you guys want to pull that up, I just have to go find our school code. There's like a certain code we have to plug in for it. That way you guys can start looking at the application, paying the fee, and that way you can take it right as soon as we're done with the class when all the information's fresh in your brain. That's what most of the students did last semester, and they did all really well on it. So hopefully you guys will have the same luck. But really that textbook, I mean, honestly, just reading through it is really all you need to do. Doing the practice questions at the end. Yep.
What is this?
I believe it's 225 now. Yeah, it used to be 200, but I think they went up to 225. Yeah, it's crazy. And then it's like you got to keep taking them. You end up spending like $5,000 by the time you're done with all these tests. It's crazy. So we're just finishing off with the last 2 chapters, QA, quality assurance, and then bioeffects. We talked about bioeffects pretty much throughout the entire semester, but we never really talked about what those actually are. We just know that we need to be aware of them in terms of keeping our patient safe and healthy. QA, this is not something that you guys will ever do. You'll probably never even see this being done, but it's when we have the physicists who work for the manufacturing companies come in and make sure that our system and our transducers are working properly and they're within the clinical values of what we need our image and our system to be at. So this is not something that you ever need to know how to perform, but you need to know these things for the registry. And this is kind of something that everyone just brain dumps after that. So this doesn't have to occupy much space when you're studying. So QA, quality assurance, this is the routine and periodic evaluation of the ultrasound system to guarantee optimal image quality. This is a medical and legal necessity that any clinical place has to have. You also have to have, when you get QA done, documented. You guys may have heard techs talking about JRC and all of these organizations coming in and making sure everything is right. You have to have everything documented for these organizations. So the lead tech or the manager has to keep files of when QA is performed, making sure that everything is done on an annual basis typically. So here are some of those phantoms that we're going to talk about. So there are particular requirements and goals that any type of QA service has to abide by. The requirements of doing QA is that it is helpful for assessment of the system components. So when you have a physicist come in, they can say, oh, wait a minute, there's a crystal out on this transducer that is creating an artifact that maybe you guys didn't know about, right? Because we're using multi-crystal transducers. If we were using a single crystal transducer, the whole image would be gone, right? So sometimes we don't notice that crystal damage while we're scanning, but someone performing QA could come in and realize that. It's also opportunity for repairs on the system, preventative maintenance. That's the main thing with QA, making sure that our machine is still staying within the normal functioning range, and record keeping. Like we said, we have to document everything. So the goals of QA, they have to guarantee proper operation of the system, meaning the system and the transducers. They detect gradual changes that, again, we may not be able to notice while we're scanning. They minimize downtime, so it's much easier to have QA come in and just make sure everything is addressed than waiting to the point where the transducer or the machine stops working, right? Because productivity, a lot of places care about how many patients can we do, right? If our machine is down, we can't do any. So it's something that they can come in early in the morning or late at night, do a QA on the machine, make sure everything is good to go for the next day. It reduces the number of non-diagnostic exams. So if we're having all of these exams that are creating artifact, the radiologist isn't going to be able to rely on that and therefore delaying patient diagnosis. So it's reducing that number of useless exams really and reducing the number of repeat exams for that same reason. There are particular devices and certain techniques that when they come in to perform QA, they are required to use or to do. So the devices that we're commonly using with clinical ultrasound is a tissue equivalent phantom, a Doppler phantom, and a slice thickness phantom. Those are all going to test different components of the machine and the transducer. The methods are very particular. So you have to be doing this under really controlled situations. So if your room is typically set at 70 degrees, you don't want to have QA come in and drop the AC down to 50, right? Because that's not what your machine typically operates at. So you want to keep the entire environment standard. We want to be testing under known defined conditions. We're using constant instrument settings. So we're not taking a transducer from a different machine, using it on a machine to do QA. We're keeping it as streamlined as possible. We're also using those phantoms or those devices to help us figure out what's going on in that QA assessment. And again, we're imaging in an identical environment. So we're keeping our room the same. We're keeping our settings the same that we're used to scanning patients every day with. So QA, you have to have objective information, right? So the definition of objective and subjective information is that objective information is completely unbiased. It is factual, it's proven, it's finite, right? Subjective information, this is kind of like an opinion. It's influenced by certain things. So we don't want any type of QA test to be giving us subjective information. We need the information that is evaluated and documented on a QA test to be objective. It's factual, it's repeatable, and it's able to be counted. That's a really big thing that the registry will definitely be asking you a question on, objective versus subjective information. So one of those phantoms that are commonly being used, if you do happen to see a physicist come in for preventative maintenance, you'll probably see them carrying these big boxes. Those are going to be these phantoms. The tissue phantom is really multi-purpose for them because it is the equivalent of human tissue. So it's going to have the same exact speed of sound, attenuation factors, scattering characteristics, echogenicity levels, and we're using it to evaluate the entire grayscale imaging and tissue texture. They kind of place these little foci in there, if you guys can see on that image. See those like gray circles right in the middle? So we use that to help us with our axial and lateral resolution that they're testing for. Again, that echogenicity, that output power. So they're putting these variable little things in this phantom to help us test for multiple different components. So we're using this for a lot of different reasons, or they're using it for a lot of different reasons. Next is going to be a Doppler phantom. We actually had one of these laying around and it was like extremely heavy. I don't know how they carry this from like facility to facility, but this is going to help us to evaluate the Doppler settings. So the color Doppler, continuous wave, pulse wave Doppler, anything that's going to evaluate that movement of something is going to be done with the Doppler phantom. It does so by having these like vibrating strings in this phantom, and it mocks that movement of usually fluid in the body. So again, just looking at evaluating all of the Doppler components of our system. Next is our slice thickness phantom. So this is used to assess the sound beam slice thickness and elevational resolution. I haven't seen this one used too often. I'm used to seeing physicists bring in that tissue equivalent phantom and also the Doppler phantom, but I haven't really seen this being used clinically, so I'm not too familiar with how they actually evaluate the slice thickness on these phantoms. And usually with these phantoms, we're looking for specific things. We're evaluating specific things or measurements. We're looking at the sensitivity of our sound source. We're looking for evaluation of the dead zone, the focal zone. We're looking for registration accuracy, which is again, how accurate can we identify individual structures on our picture. We're looking at axial and lateral resolution, which we'll talk a little bit more about, and we already know a lot about them. Also compensation and uniformity, so our grayscale and our TGC, our gain and our TGC. Also, how well can we identify findings on our picture? So we have these mock cysts and masses that are part of these phantoms. And then also we're looking at our output power, our display settings, and our grayscale range. So they're looking at the system, they're looking at the monitor, they're looking at the transducer, they're using tissue equivalents to test all of these different things and make sure that all of our pictures are clinically useful. So sensitivity, we just said, is a performance measurement that we are looking for. So basically what we do with this is we're looking to see what the system's ability is to display low-level echoes. So we kind of want to test the normal sensitivity of our system and the maximum sensitivity. So normal sensitivity, we're keeping all of our settings on an average basis. So when you look at your TGC, it's kind of like in the middle, right, of the bars. Your gain setting kind of set at a medium gray. Our output power is at a normal lower level, and we're testing that sensitivity of how much can our system pick up with these standard average values versus maximum sensitivity, where we're putting that output power all the way to its maximum to see what that lowest amount of information we can actually get from that picture is and how useful is that information. Again, we're not doing this on a real patient. We're doing this on a phantom because we know we don't want to be using our maximum output power for bioeffect reasons, but it's saying to the physicist, this machine can evaluate this low of information or this low amount of echoes with the settings being set all the way to the maximum. Our dead zone, so we kind of talked a little bit about this, not too much, but this is the region closest to the transducer where the image is going to be inaccurate. So if you look at that top image, that represents the top of our transducer, right? The anterior most portion of anatomy, and we can't really evaluate that layer. So I think I showed a few of you guys when we were learning about standoff pads and all of those things. If you have a really superficial lump, if you put jelly in the transducer right on that lump and you put your average amount of pressure, you're not going to see it because it falls right in that dead zone. So you need some sort of standoff pad to get that focus out of the dead zone. And that is for this reason. So when they come in for QA, they are evaluating this. We want it to be as narrow as possible because we want as much clinically useful information on our picture as possible. So we said it's the region closest to the transducer. It extends from the transducer to the shallowest depth of the reflections. High frequency transducers are going to produce a thinner dead zone, right? Because they're better at evaluating superficial tissues. It's going to be tested with a series of shallowly placed pins in the tissue phantom. And then we'll be able to evaluate how the system can show those pins placed in that really shallow zone. So if you guys look at that picture, can you see my little pointer? Do you see this right here? So that's one of the pins that's in the tissue phantom. So that is saying that this system can evaluate anything in this level right underneath that dead zone. And then this is just a standoff pad that you guys are probably used to seeing by now. It's really cool when you have like a little cyst and you put like a big blob of jelly and you barely touch it and it's just like a lump right on top of the skin. I don't know. I like lumps and bumps. They're really neat. So registration accuracy, this is kind of that broad definition of how well can our image or how well can our system actually image something accurately. It is going to look at the range accuracy of our system. It's going to look at the horizontal calibration of our system. And it's also going to make sure that all of our measurements are going to be accurate. So when we're measuring something, we want that to be the true measurement, right? If our system does not have accuracy in terms of depth or distance from the sound source, then any measurement that we take deeper in the body is not going to be accurate. So we want to make sure that we're still falling within that clinically useful range. And similar to those pins that we just said for the dead zone, we do so with registration accuracy as well. And we're using all of these different pins and placements of pins to see how well the system can evaluate them. So the physicist knows where these pins are placed or where they should be placed in the phantom, and then they align that with how well the system can represent that. So if they know that this curve of pins appears at 5 centimeters depth, and our system is showing that as appearing at 7 centimeters of depth, we know something is wrong with that system and it needs to be recalibrated. Next, we have our focal zone. So this is where we want to concentrate our sound beam while we're scanning. And of course, if this isn't working properly, that's not really going to be our friend, and we need to evaluate that. So our focus, we know, is the depth at which the beam is going to be the narrowest and also the most intense, and we're going to get a clinically useful image from that focal zone and focal placement. Our focal zone is going to be the region that's surrounding that focus. It's going to have really great lateral resolution, so structures that are positioned next to each other are really going to be well defined. And the systems with an adjustable focus must be evaluated. So any system that you're going to be using in the clinical world will have the option for focal adjustment. So this is something that has to be included in those QA performance measurements. So do you guys kind of see how on all of these tissue phantoms, this is the same thing that was being tested for the range accuracy, right? Okay. Axial and lateral resolution. We've talked about this several times this semester. It's the ability of the system to display things either side by side or one in front of the other and still represent two different structures. So we want to be able to have things that are really closely positioned to each other, but still represent their own two reflections. So this is, again, something that they are going to be testing for. They do so by pins. They know where these reflections are placed. So they'll be able to test the system's ability to make sure that they're within that really small distance. Next, we have our compensation and our uniformity. So this is going to be our gain and most particularly our TGC, making sure that that is accurately represented on our screen. So it's the system's ability to display similar reflections in the phantom with echoes of equal brightness. As we know, our posterior portion of our screen is going to be much darker. We're going to get lower level echoes from that region. So we use our TGC to compensate for that, and we rely on that as well to make our picture uniformly echogenic. So we're testing for that on a tissue equivalent phantom as well. And then we have these mock cysts and masses. Again, the system's ability to accurately display fluid-filled structures as anechoic and solid structures as echogenic. We wouldn't want a cyst to appear very echogenic, right? Because then we're going to assume that it's not a cyst. So we want to make sure that our system can do that accurately. Okay, moving on to our bioeffects really quickly, just a few slides on this. So with anything in healthcare, the risks have to outweigh, the benefits have to outweigh the risks. Scratch that. So obviously we don't want to cause any unnecessary harm to our patient. Ultrasound is not exempt from that. We're not using radiation, which is a great thing. So we're already keeping our patient a little bit safer from bioeffects, but there are still some things that we need to be aware of in terms of our system to make sure that we're keeping our patients safe, especially our pregnant patients. So this is something that we are responsible for. QA, this is that legal reason why we need to be performing QA to make sure that our system is operating as well as possible. So low intensity ultrasound has no known bioeffects. So we've been around since like the 1980s and there's still no known bioeffects for clinical ultrasound, which is great. You would think that they would have maybe found them by now, but we really haven't. So that's awesome. Extremely high intensities can cause tissue damage, but there are no reported cases of imaging at high intensities. So again, really great. Dosimetry, this is known as identifying and measuring characteristics of the sound beam that are related to the potential effects. So I don't know if you guys remember Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes when she was pregnant with Suri, he bought her an ultrasound machine. Did you guys ever hear that?
No.
He like rented an ultrasound machine and scanned the baby every single day. Yeah. Or like they had somebody come in and scan the baby every single day. And even then there were no bioeffects. So yeah. Nope. I mean, when I heard that I was like, wait a minute. Like that is not good, especially somebody who's not trained doing this. So there are two different types of bioeffects that we need to be aware of, or kind of two different methods that we need to be aware of, in vivo and in vitro. We're going to learn a lot about in vitro over the summer and the fall, but it's really just talking about a type of technique that you're doing research or testing on. In vivo means that you are doing research performed within a living subject, and in vitro means that you are doing research performed outside of a living subject. Bioeffects are constantly being studied in both environments. I would definitely want to be the patient doing in vitro. I don't know if I would want to be considered part of a study with having it done on me. So we have certain instruments that we can use to test for mainly the intensities of the sound wave. Again, not something that you guys are ever going to be performing, but you do have to be familiar with these instruments and these terms. So a hydrophone, also known as a microprobe, is just one way to kind of measure the sound energy, mainly through a water environment. That's this picture right up here. Calibrated hydrophone just means that they have it set to particular settings. Radiation force, this is something that although we don't produce radiation in ultrasound, when we have that conversion of energy, right? So we have all of that sound energy being absorbed, converted into heat in really large quantities, not anything that we're doing in ultrasound, but in really large quantities, that change of the sound wave creates momentum away from it. And we consider that momentum created by that change to be a radiation force. So it's not actual radiation being created, it's just what we're referring to any energy that has been caused or is a result of a change in that sound wave's propagation. That makes sense. It's kind of a broad theory. And then also we can use the Schlerin. I don't even know if I say that right, but it's a type of instrument that can actually photograph moving fluid. So this bottom picture is actually showing radiation force. So see how as these two jets are propelling, we're seeing it create that momentum change in the area around it, right? So all of this is going to be radiation force. It's kind of like if you ever go to the air show and you like see the jets flying and then you hear the noise of them. Yes, those are jets, yeah. It's a very abstract picture, yeah. So next we need to be aware of sound to heat being converted. As we just said, anytime we're looking at energy conversion, we need to be aware of the effects of that. When we're using this for clinical ultrasound, we know that that is going to result in absorption. The tissue is just going to absorb that heat. We need to measure the output power of the transducer's absorption, and we can do so by 3 different things. A calorimeter, this measures the total power of a sound beam through absorption, and it gives us temperature changes and heating time. So how fast did this temperature change occur? We can also use a thermocouple. This is a thermometer used to measure power of a sound beam in a specific location. We can also use a liquid crystal, and when this crystal is heated up, it's going to change its color. So we can evaluate the color of that crystal depending on how much temperature change had occurred. Again, not something that you guys will probably ever see. I've never seen any of these bioeffect tests being done. So just something that you need to be aware of. So study techniques, again, on a very scientific level, there are 2 different approaches that you can use for study techniques. Mechanistic approach, this is our cause and effect. So basically we use theory to assume that if we know the cause of something, we can predict the effects that it's going to have, right? So it's like we do our research up front, and then we kind of assume what's going to happen based off of that research. Whereas the empirical approach, this is going to be our exposure and response. So basically, just do what you're going to do, and then we'll see what happens. So it kind of goes back to a little bit of like that in vivo versus in vitro. Would we want to use an empirical approach on an in vivo study? Probably not, right? We don't want to just see what happens on a real patient, right? We want to do that on a non-living patient. So again, we're using all of these study techniques and approaches to constantly evaluate if ultrasound can produce clinically significant bioeffects. So bioeffects result from high tissue temperatures. Sound converts to heat, as we just said, as it travels through the body. Any elevation of body temperature can result in tissue or organ damage or malfunction. And we use a thermal index to predict those temperature increases in those specific tissues. So we really don't ever want our tissues being heated. And that's the main thing with keeping a low intensity sound wave while we're scanning. So a radiation force, so using non-thermal approach of bioeffects, We mainly care about heating up of the tissue, but there are also other things that we need to be aware of. A radiation force, as we just said, that's caused by that, excuse me, that change to our sound beam propagation. So that's going to have an effect on those surrounding tissues. And cavitation, this is a big one. This is one that people are studying quite a bit. This is the interaction of sound waves with gas bubbles in the tissue. The bubbles are caused by creation of gas in the tissues, and there are two different types. They're stable and transient. Stable microbubbles, at lower intensity, the bubbles are going to vibrate and they get bigger, but they never burst. And then transient bubbles at really high intensities, the bubbles will actually burst and send out shock waves to the surrounding tissue. So cavitation is the most likely type of bioeffect to cause some type of tissue damage or malfunction, but we do need to be aware of thermal issues as well. As we know, with any type of infection, right, or inflammation of the tissue, anytime that tissue is constantly responding to increased temperatures, it starts to die off over time. So that's going to be the same concept of if we're artificially elevating the temperature of the tissue as well. Any questions?